One of the greatest challenges we have as educators is finding ways to make learning relevant for our students. In today's episode, Dr. Bill Robertson introduces us to action science and the ways he is making his teaching relevant and creating opportunities for the most active kind of learning I can imagine. Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential. Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. This is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to increase our personal productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. I'm so happy to be welcoming today Dr. Bill Robertson. He's an associate professor in the teacher education department in the College of Education, and he also serves as the co-chair of the teacher education department at the University of Texas at El Paso. He leads the Division of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Education, and he has expertise in the area of science education, curriculum development, and technology integration. He also develops researches and teaches materials related to problem-based learning and action science. And there's a lot more to his bio, but I'm going to welcome him to the show now so that we can hear about one story I think will be best to get straight from him. Bill, welcome to Teaching in Higher Ed.
Thanks for having me on, Bonnie. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here.
The story that I think people would love to hear directly from you is about your Fulbright. Can you talk a little bit about how you actually got that experience and what it was like for you?
Absolutely. Well, in 2008, in the fall, I ended up going on a Fulbright based in Santiago, Chile. And the background in it is kind of interesting. I had a friend, Nora Bynum, who was on a Fulbright, and she got back from it in Mexico and said, "You should really think about going on a Fulbright, Bill." And I said, "Well, I'm not the kind of person that people pick to go on Fulbrights." And she said, "You should really rethink it because you're exactly the kind of person who should go." And she was a good friend, and she motivated me, so I decided to apply for it. In that same time, I'd had an experience where we had a number of visitors here at the University of Texas at El Paso who came from a university in Santiago de Chile, and as things would happen, they ended up staying in my house. And so we had lots of conversations, and they were all in Spanish. They were, very immersive. But the thing I found was that we had a lot of things in common concerning science education, the constructivist methodology, and just our approach for working with pre-service and in-service teachers. So when that happened, I also had a university that I could target. And so I ended up going there in the summer of 2008 and stayed through December through that same year. So I went in the winter in Chile and came back in December. One of the interesting things about that time was I'm not a native Spanish speaker by any means. I have taken plenty of classes. I now have a degree in Spanish, but when it's one thing to be sort of academic about it or to practice in certain places, but to suddenly be considered an academic in another country was very challenging, because not only did you have to know sort of the language of the society, you also had to know the language of the profession. And I was placed in a department of physics. And, I'm a science educator, not a physicist. And so often what would happen was I would get a lot of terms incorrect. And so, for instance, I remember them one time, I would say something like, we were talking about a certain concept, like the center of gravity. And I would say, este es el centro de gravedad. And someone in the audience, a fellow professor would say, no, Bill. No es centro de gravedad, es el punto de equilibrio. And so they would correct me. And then the vibe was, who is this North American? He doesn't really even know his stuff, But because I was struggling a bit with the technical language. Over time, that got a lot better. But I think one of the great things I learned from that is how people who are learning a second language may know exactly what they're talking about and might not be able to express it. And working and living here on the border of the U.S. and Mexico, and I live in El Paso, Texas, and Juarez is on the other side, and we have 80% Mexican-American population, very bilingual, bicultural, and I work with a lot of English language learners. So in some ways it helped me to really internalize what English language learners would work through.
One of the things I thought was so fun when I looked at your LinkedIn profile too, I know that the way that they order things on LinkedIn is forced to be chronological. And you actually you indicate that I actually got this degree in 2009, the Spanish language and literature. But one of the things I really enjoy that shows about you is your own willingness to be a lifelong learner, because that can't have been easy either. I mean, going and actually living in the culture, speaking the language within an academic institution, you described the challenge of that, but even just going back to school after you'd already earned your doctorate.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because it was funny because I just wanted to take some classes in Spanish and try to improve. And when I tried to take some here at UTEP, they said, yeah, you're welcome to take classes, and you need to enroll. And I said, well, I'm a professor here, I just want to take some undergraduate classes. And they said, great, you just need to enroll. And so I had to apply for admission to the university. I was accepted. And
that's great.
I was classified as senior. And then, I started on an academic program and ended up taking, 10 classes and conferred a Bachelor of Arts degree in Spanish. But I think for me too, it was a challenge for learning. But the other thing is we have a lot of non-traditional students here in El Paso, and many come from, whether they return from the military or they're, have had a family and they come back to school. So even being an older person in class, I wasn't necessarily looked at as different. And in many ways, I became sort of the undercover professor. And I learned a lot about students and how students live here. I'm not from El Paso, so it really taught me a lot about the lives of our students and, how they balance work and family and, school and everything else. Ironically, one of the things that was funny is I would have students, classmates who knew me as a Spanish student, and they would show up in an education class, and they would say, "Oh, cool, you're in this class too," They start talking to me, and then everybody would come in, and I'd say, "Excuse me," and I'd stand up, and then I would have to teach, and they actually didn't know I was a professor. So all my professors in Spanish knew I was, because I self-identified, but for the students, they didn't. So it was a good immersive experience. It was super challenging, but again, it was the way I think about education. As a lifelong learner, more education equals more opportunities, and with that, I was able to actually go to Chile and live and enjoy an educational experience there too.
Both of those experiences just sound like they've given you so much empathy as a professor. And I know for myself, I can't ever get enough of that. I always yearn for the ability to put on those lenses of what is it like for our students today. So tell me about action science, because many of us who are engaged in this conversation might have heard of action sports before. So what is action science?
I had been in action sports, and I started to try to combine things that were sort of in the realm of action sports and science, and we started to use this term of action science, and specifically I started with the sports of skateboarding and BMX. I've been a skateboarder since I was 13 years old. I'm getting ready I'll be celebrating my 40th year as a skateboarder this year, and it's something I've enjoyed doing. It's something I've competed at. It's something I did as an amateur, a pro, and also as in doing demonstrations, and it's just a lot of fun. It's something I enjoy, and same with, I had a lot of friends who did BMX. But, early on, I realized there was a lot of physics and concepts in these sports that could be expressed and that were also very engaging and motivating, not only for the students, but also for teachers, because teachers would start to see some of the efforts we were doing, and they would say, oh, this is going to help me so much to reach this specific group of students. And the type of student they were identifying was probably someone a lot like me in school, who was maybe, not super interested in school all the time, a little creative, and was looking for a new way to connect. And I was trying to reach that marginalized student in many ways. It started more as a live action piece that I did. I do demonstrations in school, and then we started to do videos. We produced a series called Dr. Skateboard's Action Science, which focused on forces, motion, Newton's laws of motion, and simple machines, and used that in schools all around El Paso. And then, since then, we've been really working on a lot of, I'd say, more big time or maybe arena shows, informal science and festivals, but also using a lot more video as a way of trying to deliver primary content in science or in STEM to learners in sort of a video format, because we find that the video is very portable, very consumable, and people will watch it over and over, unlike a textbook where they really won't read it at all.
And I'm going to encourage people who are listening to definitely go to the show notes for this episode. They'll be at teachinginhighered.com/85, because you've got to see Dr. Skateboard on the skateboard. You've got to see I was completely riveted when I went to go start watching them, just how you are able to bring in these concepts, but keep the attention like nobody's business, just through the video and the power of action science. That's exactly what it is. Well, you have written a book on action science. That's the main title of the book, but your subtitle is Relevant Teaching and Active Learning. So let's tackle those two terms just one at a time. How do you see relevance as important in our teaching?
So often teachers want to find a way to connect with students, and in many ways they're also looking to manage their classroom throughout the day. And a lot of times I hear from students, or even from anyone, is they always ask the question, what's the point, or why are we doing this? And I think that's something that's on the the forefront of every learner, whether you're in a school or you're at a meeting or anything like that. It's this relevance piece. How can I connect this to my own experience? And so a couple of things I think are really important about working with relevant teaching. One is you have to pay attention to who your audience is, who your learner is, and you also have to find ways to integrate the interests of your learner into your curriculum. And typically we go the other way. We try to force our curriculum into our learners, and so for me, relevant teaching is about choice. It's more student-centered. It's teacher-facilitated, and it also draws on the strengths of the students. So whether that be in subject matter, if you've got artists, you got guitar players, you got dancers, you got sports enthusiasts, you got people who are good at language, and it also draws on their gifts in the way they want to express themselves. So not always asking for a paper, but maybe giving them an option of producing a documentary or a PowerPoint that they can narrate, and doing some type of alternative assessment that can be evaluated by a rubric. The idea also, I think, leads to the fact that teachers are always looking for things they can use. And a big part of what I find in my approach is, especially at the university, is often people are comfortable delivering theory, but they're not always comfortable remembering that we have to turn it into practice. And a big part of what we've done here at UTEP is, we've found ourselves in the schools. We're part of professional development networks. And that means that we have to not only bring the theory, but the theory into practice. And so I think that's very important, that students and even teachers, whether they're in a workshop or in a classroom, need to come away with something that they can use in the classroom. And that was something I learned early on, when I was working at another job as a program coordinator. Teachers would tell me, hey, this is great. Don't give me all the theory. Give me something I can use. So I pretty much tried to develop things that are pragmatic, practical, relevant, real-world based that teachers can use in the classroom themselves.
With active learning, that is one of those phrases that has a whole bunch of different meanings. And if we were to go start to break that one down, we'd be introduced to a lot of different authors. But in your case, when you talk about active learning, you really, really, really mean the active and active learning. Can you talk a little bit about your own definition and perspective on what active learning is all about?
Active learning for me, really means engaging the student holistically. For me, one of the things is that you have to have a framework from which to operate. And so, like in the book, or even in my teaching of any classroom, I found myself in sort of a constructivist-based methodology. And And what this does is it starts with, it has a 5E or a framework that you follow, and it's engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. And in a nutshell, what you try to do is you try to hook students or connect to them, to engage them, to get them motivated to be involved. And then in the exploration, you're actually turning them loose to allow them to have time to interact, whether that be discussing things amongst themselves, researching things, on the computer or in the classroom, maybe going outside to collect some data. It's a very open-ended part, but it's very, they're very hands-on and minds-on during that time. And very little direct instruction is happening during these two events. And then as you move into sort of the explain, typically students are trying to make sense of what they do. And then during the elaborate phase, you have an opportunity to bring in strong content to increase the breadth and depth of their knowledge. And then, of course, you evaluate students in whether that be in a test or in some product that they produce, that you evaluate with a rubric. That's a way of doing that. But I think, the main thing to me is, we're very comfortable doing something in class that we call an activity. And we understand often that we've got to cover specific content. But I think teachers, need to have greater depth and variety in the methodologies they use, because I believe an activity consists of content and method. So one of the things I try to do is demonstrate a lot of different methods, whether it's Socratic questioning, jigsawing, scaffolding, using cooperative groups, think, pair, share. So trying to keep the strategies different and also taking the time to deconstruct them to show, like, why did I use this strategy? So for me, it's about keeping people engaged, but also keeping them sort of on their toes. And I think that if you create an environment that has sort of people, a little bit of uncertainty, but also they trust you that you're going in the right direction, and it seems fun, they're willing to try different things with you. So using different methods for different content to achieve your goal is a big part of active learning.
What do you see as some of the ways that you're able to build up that trust? Because that resonates with me so much, where you are really asking your students to do something that's uncomfortable for them. I mean, learning should be uncomfortable for us, so we're probably not getting the full value out of it. So what are some ways you build up that trust?
So in order to build up the trust, the first thing I know is that, what I need to do is I need to drive students or learners or anyone to an area of high risk and a high ambiguity. That's really where learning occurs, in my opinion. So, high risk, they've got to try something that, they've never done, and high ambiguity, they don't know what's going to come out. And that can be a very vulnerable spot for you as an individual, and especially within a classroom setting. But that's where real learning occurs. The type of learning I'm talking about, too, is sort of the upper part of Bloom's taxonomy, the critical thinking, the analysis, synthesis, evaluation, and creativity of your thinking and working with material. But first off, you have to develop a safe environment. You have to give students an opportunity to be willing to go to those places. They have to say, I basically trust this guy to lead me to the place he says he's going to do it. So a lot of that is setting a tone in the classroom. I really do think that, and even in meetings or whatever, it's very flat. I try to know that good ideas can come from everyone. I also try to let people know that their interests are important. So I take the time to actually get to know people. I talk to people before class or after class, or we do a lot of stuff online. So I'll be reading things about that they post, and then I'll invoke those into the classroom. So I think that helps to do that. I never single out a single individual. I always kind of model, talking to the group, and then when someone, brings it forward, I'll bring them in. So I'm not one who will identify a student and put them on the spot. I'll kind of go the other way. And I think that over time they start to see, hey, he's breaking my interest in. He's really listening to me. And, in that sense, I kind of help to create that safe environment. But the other part of my job is really to push them, to get them to kind of step out of their comfort zone and to kind of, if you will, coach them through some of these places. So how I do that a lot is I'll we'll go through an experience, and then I'll basically deconstruct it and tell them why I did certain things and what I did, and then I'll get some feedback from them, and I integrate that feedback. So I think that's another part that they know their voice is being heard.
When Stephen Brookfield was on the show pretty early on, I'll put a link to his episode in the show notes in case anybody wants to go back to listen who hasn't been listening for that long. One of the things he described was just how normal it is for students to get angry when we put them in areas of high risk and high ambiguity. And that's something that's always helpful for me to know, that as an educator, my goal shouldn't always be to be having everyone be perfectly comfortable and therefore perfectly happy in a class. That sometimes, and you use the phrase push them, and that we don't like to be pushed. But then you used the phrase, as you were describing it, I tell them why I did certain things. So you're able to go back and look at the past and say, this part where you felt uncomfortable and I was pushing you, here's why I was doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. That was, I hear a couple of things from you. One is just a real place of empathy. And then a second thing that I'm hearing, though, is empathy enough to also not leave you right where you are. Empathy to recognize that I'm not really helping you if we don't achieve something new and something risky and something with ambiguity.
Yeah, because for the most part, I think, learners learn. And often people will complain, the students didn't really get it. And I'm a firm believer that, the students in our classes or the people in our workshops or in our meetings are really smart, motivated people. And we just have to find a way to help them to be able to use their gifts in what they're doing. And so a lot of times people see themselves as disconnected from their education. And so they kind of check out, and they don't see that maybe the skills of what they're really good at can apply to something like education. This has been something I've done a lot with skateboarders and others who often don't see them. They see the world of skateboarding and the world of education as completely separate, and that I'm going to make a choice. I'm going to be a pro skateboarder, so I need to drop out of school. And my attitude has always been, you can be successful in both. In fact, I always tell people the things that made me successful in skateboarding, persistence, dedication, tenacity, creativity, setting goals, those types of things made me successful in education. And in fact, I was more successful in skateboarding as a young person than I ever was in education. But I learned to apply those principles, that way of working, to what I was doing in my education, and that really helped. And that's been a big part of my mission, not only for skateboarders, but just for learners, that if they're really good at something and they can, in a sense, master something, they can probably master something else. So if they're really good at the violin, then they know how hard it is to get that good at it. And maybe they can apply those same principles to their education or to something else they want to learn. That to me is really where you're trying to, it's not so much push as it is to coach the learners, but also to have faith to try to inspire them so that they can use their gifts to grow.
Before we started recording, I told you a story about a scar that I have, and I'm just so sorry you have to hear the story again. I would like to apologize in advance. So I have a scar that I have from skateboarding right down Fire Mountain Drive, the street that I grew up on, and right on my knees, because that's a great way to ride your skateboard, is on your knees. Fell right onto one of those little curved cement borders that people used to put in the 1970s in their grass. And sorry for anyone listening if you still have those borders in your grass. They probably still exist. At any rate, the scar actually has moved. It used to be right in the middle of my upper lip, and it has just moved slightly off to the left as my body grew from childhood. And so here's my question to you. I will finally get to the point. What is a scar that you have from your teaching? Something that has maybe moved around, but you're still cognizant of a lesson that you learned from a failure in your own teaching?
There's one that happened that I use a lot, and it's one that happened a number of years ago, but it continues to resonate with me, and I think also with the students I work with. Before I became a professor, and even before other jobs, I was a high school and a middle school teacher, and at first I was a high school teacher, and I liked being a high school teacher because one of the things you could do is you could be, sarcastic with students, and it worked really well. They would get your humor, and they were semi-adult, and, you could have good conversations, and, you could have fun. And then I moved to the middle school. I taught sixth grade science. And I remember, I'm kind of the generation of like, Airplane and, Caddyshack, kind of humor. And and so a student came up to me and handed me an assignment, a little sixth grader, and I grabbed it and I said, "Oh, thank you very little," which is sort of a classic Chevy Chase line, and immediately he looked at me and he started to cry. And at that point I realized, I can't just wing this, and I had to really start to understand how learners learn. And at a middle school level, people were all over the map. They were at different places developmentally, physically, emotionally, intellectually, and I really had to start to become a student of my students. And I think that time at teaching in a middle school was when I really learned how to teach, because what I didn't want to do was make people feel vulnerable or upset. I wanted this to be a safe place. But I also knew that I needed to change my ways, and I needed to probably put a little more time into my craft, because a crying student in your class will take you a long way, especially if you feel like you caused that. So for me, that was a wound that I kind of learned early on, and something that I think still resonates with me today, because it's important to understand the learner, but it's also, like you said, to be empathetic, but to be kind and caring along the way, because really, in education, especially at the university, we're in the success business, and we're trying to help people get to some place they've already decided they want to go. So in many ways, that lesson was well learned early on in my teaching career, and it's something I think that I still keep close even today.
Do you have any good scar stories just about your own experience with action sports? Anything that you feel like sharing? Because mine was just the best scar story ever. But do you have anything you'd like to top my?
I think your story is good. Suffice it to say, I've had plenty of injuries, but interestingly enough, a lot more of my injuries came in other sports like high school wrestling or football or other traditional sports that I did early on. And like I mentioned, I'm getting ready to do my 40th year of skateboarding. I've had a couple of injuries. I moved from being sort of the young guy who would take all the chances to sort of the older guy in the helmet at the park, and I'm okay with that, because I've enjoyed this for some time. But the one thing I know about with skateboarding, and I went skateboarding yesterday, and I got a new scar from yesterday, is skateboarders fall down. And that's a big part of what you do. I mean, gravity really impacts you, and when you're skateboarding, you fall down. But the other thing about that is, as a skateboarder, not only how to fall down, but how to get back up. And I think this is something that also resonates with people in education, because, it's not so much that we try to have all this success. It's kind of overcoming the obstacles in our lives and maybe even our failures. And so that's one of the things I think skateboarders and people who do action sports can really relate to, because to get to that spot where they have done something, they have had to fail a lot, and they've also had to take a little bit of a beating along the way. They fall down and they get up. And I think we use that a lot as a metaphor for success, but I do think that that's something that's very internalized to me. So to answer your question, had some interesting scars, of course. Got a new one yesterday, and I anticipate getting another one the next time I go skateboarding.
Well, this is the time in the show that we do recommendations, and I'm so excited because somebody actually that listens to the show wrote in, and I'm going to use her recommendation to me for the broader audience. This is from Pamela, and she starts her email to me just thanking me for the podcast. She's been teaching since 1973, and she says, quote, "I'm not too old to learn new ideas. I'm just sorry I didn't find you sooner." And that was really kind of you to say, Pamela. And she wants to recommend the book Training in Motion by Mike Kakzala. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but we'll have a link to it in the show notes at teachinginhighered.com/85. And she says this book emphasizes the importance of movement for learning and not just for regular exercise. It's backed by research. Kakzala also provides a number of very short, simple movement exercises that can be used in class. And this is something that I've experimented with for years now, is just getting people up out of their seats, whether it's just going around to take sticky notes. I've written on my blog before about teaching with stickies. If you want to go check out those posts, I'll put them in the show notes too. But something really magnificent happens when we get out of our seats. And I also have talked before on the podcast about getting students out of their seats when they're taking exams and doing a stretch break. And that really, students have said, helps them a lot with just if they have any kind of test anxiety, just to get a little bit of oxygen flowing and do those deep breaths and everything. So I'm really looking forward, Pamela, to checking out Training in Motion. Thanks so much for writing in with that recommendation. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Bill, for a couple of recommendations I know you want to make.
The first is I'd like to bring out is a nonprofit called Skatistan. And Skatistan is a nonprofit that uses skateboarding as a tool for empowerment. And it really has a large commitment to working with young women in Afghanistan, Cambodia, and South Africa. And the interesting thing about this group is, they're based in Berlin. They're people from Australia, the leaders originally from Australia, and they're putting themselves out there working with populations that many of us might overlook or maybe even be fearful of, and they're trying to demonstrate effective ways to educate these kind of marginalized students in innovative and creative manners. So Skatistan is a great cause, and I think also a great effort that they're doing to focus on helping young women through skateboarding. The second thing I'd like to mention is Edutopia. And Edutopia was originally set up as sort of an arm of the George Lucas Foundation. And now with our new Star Wars movie out, hopefully people will also look at many of the innovative educational pieces that came out of Edutopia. And it's really an educational portal which is dedicated to transforming K-12 education. I like it because, it gives educators practical resources that you can use directly in your classroom in terms of your instruction, your pedagogy, and then the content that you might use around, fundamental educational topics. It also gives great video resources that you can use for teaching and learning. So Skatistan and Edutopia are my two resources.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. I'm looking forward to I can't pronounce it, Skatistan?
Skatistan, yeah.
Skatistan was a really fun thing to go check out. I hope people will check that out in the show notes at teachinginhighered.com/85. Bill, what do you want to leave us with today about action science, about relevant teaching, about active learning before we close the episode?
First off, I wanted to say thank you very much, Bonnie, for having me on the show, and I've enjoyed, being a part of it, of course, but I also think that what you're putting together is a great service for all of us in education, and I'm honored and feel very blessed to be a part of this today. I think one of the main things I think we need to kind of recount is that all of us are learning, and all of us have something where we can teach and contribute. And I think a lot of times what I've tried to do is create environments where the learning is shared. And people always ask me, you've been a teacher for a long time. Why do you teach? And I constantly reply, it's because I like to learn. And I think that having that sort of learning first kind of attitude as a teacher is something that most teachers share, and especially people who stay in the profession. I would like to see, more people, spend longer in the profession, and I would really like to see some of these methodologies that we've used, whether it be the constructivist methodology, if you want to call it active learning, making the curriculum relevant, practical, pragmatic, real-world based, giving students choice, making things student-centered and teacher-facilitated. The right time for that is now. And I also think that it's also a great time to expand sort of our body of resources, not just to include things, say, on the internet in the same way, but to build new curriculum. There's great ways of doing that in video, by building apps, but also giving people sort of experiential opportunities. So to me, these are the kinds of things I think we should think about as educators, and that would hopefully help keep the practice of teaching and the art of teaching at the forefront and for a great future.
Thanks so much for your willingness to come on the show and inspire us all in these ways and really challenge us pushing us to get to new places. And part of that, by the way, requires vulnerability. So just thanks for being a safe place for us to have this conversation.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Bonnie. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
A final word of thanks to Dr. Bill Robertson for investing your time today, for being on the show, and especially to all of you who have been emailing me lately with ideas for the show, including the one we mentioned from Pamela. And I've got some other ones in the hopper too. It's just so much fun to hear from you, what you're getting out of the show, and also to challenge me to be pushing the envelope even further to what we might do with this podcast. So thanks so much for that. And for those of you who have yet to get in touch, please do so at teachinginhighered.com/feedback, or you can touch base with me on Twitter at BONNI208, Bonnie without an E, 208. I'd love to hear from you there. And just as always, I'd like to remind you, if you have yet to subscribe to the show notes for the episodes, you can get a weekly email in your inbox and not have to remember to go look up all the links. You can just go subscribe at teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. And when you do that, you'll receive a free Ed Tech Essentials Guide with 19 tools that'll help you integrate educational technology into your teaching and productivity. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time.